Hi guys and welcome to .NET Mastery. In this short video, I will walk you through using Azure Redis Cache in .NET application. Before we get started, let's take a look at why we need caching. So let's assume we have an application where user uses the application. We usually have a database to store the data and retrieve that data when the user wants it. Every time when user reads data, we go to the database to fetch that data, and most often this happens with every request. This behavior is completely okay and normal, but it is not the most optimized scenario, because every time we go to the database to fetch data, it takes some time, which is often referred to as an expense. Because of that, database calls are expensive, especially if it is combining many tables to fetch the required data. So how can we optimize the scenarios? Many times what happens is the data that we are retrieving does not change that often. So rather than fetching the data from the database every time, we can fetch it once and then we can reuse that data again. And that can be done with the use of caching. When we implement caching, we still have the application and the database. But now we also have something new, which is a cache. Caching acts as a temporary data store. When you cache something, it stores the data in memory so that it does not have to interact with database to retrieve the data every time. Caching stores data in a very simple data structure like a key-value pair. So typically you will have to serialize and deserialize complex object. So now that we have cache inside our presentation, let's see how a typical request will look like. When a request for some data arrives the first time, it will check if that exists inside the cache. Since this is the first request, it will not exist inside the cache, so it will return a null value. Then the application will go to our database and it will get the data from database. But after it gets the data, it will not return back. It will actually add the data that it retrieved inside the Azure Cache with a unique key value for the next time. So when the next time the user is requesting the same data, it will check in the Azure Cache that is there the data for this particular key. Since we added that last time, Azure Cache will say yes, I have that data, and it will return back that data. So you can see this way we are saving the database call, which will save us time and resources and ultimately improving the application's performance. Implementing a cache seems simple and straightforward, but there are some things that you should be careful about. First thing is that you should be careful about what information you are storing in the cache. Critical information which are time sensitive should never be cached, like a stock price or a live scoring in a game. We typically cache data that does not change very often, because of which caching such data will reduce the database call. We should also be careful about when the data in the cache should be deleted, since no matter what data you have, at some point in time, it needs to be refreshed with the new data. Sometimes it could be every hour, sometimes every 24 hours. That depends on the business requirements. These implementations are typically done by setting an invalidation policy, which defines when the data in a cache will become invalid. You also need to make sure that you implement the right policies to find the right balance. For example, if you delete data from cache every minute, then it will have to repopulate that data from the database almost every time. So in this case, your application will have minimum performance benefit. So you need to find the correct balance when you are implementing caching in your project. With that brief overview, let's see some benefit the Azure Redis Cache brings to the table. Now that we have seen the advantages of caching our data, we have the Azure Redis Cache, which is a high-performance caching service that provides in-memory data store for faster retrieval of data. It is based on the open source implementation of Redis Cache. You can also cache data in other services like Azure Storage, Cosmos DB, or even SQL database. But Azure Cache for Redis is the service that is specifically designed for caching. Because of that, it has its own advantages. Azure Cache helps organizations focus on freeing up the entangled resources, enabling the organization to improve their core business practices and overall efficiency. In-memory data stores are capable of super fast performance with average read or write operation taking less than a millisecond. So that will be much more faster when it comes to going to the database. The next benefit is Azure Cache for Redis is fully managed by Microsoft. So that reduces a lot of overhead that developers have to deal with. Since it is managed by Microsoft, we can be sure that security and availability will not be an issue. Azure offers the best-in-class enterprise security solution. And same goes for availability as well. Azure Cache also gives an option of disaster recovery via geo-replication. So if your application is hosted on Azure and you have other services with Azure, it makes complete sense to go for Azure Cache for Redis. I will go to portal.azure.com and inside the services here, I will search for Azure Cache for Redis. We will click on the link there and we will hit the Create button. We will have to select a subscription here and resource group. I will select Azure Learning. When you work with Azure Cache, it will have a DNS name, so we need to make some name. Let me use .netmastery.redis.cache.windows.net. Make sure to select the location close to where you will be hosting the application. Next, we need to select the cache type, and it depends on the pricing model as well. We will go with the cheapest option. Let me scroll down. It is the C0 Basic that has 250 MB of cache. Now, of course, if you have more connections or if you need more data to be cached, you can make that selection according to your business requirement. We will go with the basic C0 version and let's hit next. We have the networking tab for the connectivity here, but if we go to the advanced, we have the Redis cache version that you want for the Azure Cache for Redis. We will select the version 6 here, and you can tag anything if you want to this resource. Once everything looks good, we can go to Review plus Create, and let's create our Redis cache. Perfect, our deployment is complete and the resource has been created. If we click on Go to Resource, it will take us to the Azure Cache for Redis. Before we take a look at few configuration here, let me create a .NET application where we will be using the Azure Cache for Redis. Now that we have created the Azure Cache for Redis, let me open up Visual Studio 2022. I already have a solution here, which is Azure Fundamentals, where I teach the blob storage Azure function and Azure Logic app. Here we will right-click on the solution and add a new folder. I will call this Azure Redis Cache, and inside there, let me create a new project. The project that we want is a .NET Core MVC application, so you can either search for that. I already have it here. Let's hit the next button. I will give it a project name of Redis Cache and hit the next button. For the framework, we will select .NET 6, and for the authentication type, let me select individual account. The reason behind that is I want the database to be created. That way we do not have to waste time on configuring the DB context. So if we examine the app settings here, we have a connection string, and the database, let me change this to Redis Cache. Perfect, that looks good. Inside the models folder, let me create a new model here. So a new class, let me call that as category. And I will add 3 properties: ID, name, and description. Let me open the DB context, which is application DB context, and let me add a DB set here. This will be on category. That way we can add that to the database. We will add the using statement, and this looks good. In order to add category to our database, we will close everything here, NuGet package manager, console here, and here we will add a new migration. We will call that add category to DB. These are the basic steps that we have with .NET Core. If you have not worked with .NET Core or Entity Framework Core, I have a free course on that, so you can go to .NET Mastery and check that out. We have an error here because we need to set the Redis cache as the startup project. Let's run that command one more time here, and we get the error. Here also we will have to change the project to Redis cache. And perfect, it is creating the migration. Let's run the command update database to actually create that database in SQL Server. And perfect, our migration has completed successfully. Let me open up the SQL Server Management Studio, connect to the same database here, open that database, and we have Redis cache. We have few tables. The main table that we care about is the category table. Perfect. So category table has been created in our database, and we have the corresponding model. So we can continue from the next video. Now that we have added the category model, let's perform CRUD operations on category. So inside the controllers, we have the built-in helper. Let's add a controller with Entity Framework. Let's hit add here. We already have a DB context. We need to select the category model, application DB context, and let's add that. That will create the views for CRUD operation and also configure Entity Framework Core to use our categories table. This scaffolding is a great tool to get things up and running. And perfect, that is great. Let's go to views. Inside shared, we have underscore layout. Let me change this link to the category. The action will be index and controller will be categories controller. That's the name that we have for our controller. So with that in place, let's run the application. The startup project is Redis cache, so that's perfect. So here, if we go on category, we should see the default view that was created. We can create new category. I will call this category test1 description test description 1. Let's create. Let me create few more categories. Perfect, so we have 3 categories that have been created here. Now in the next video, let's start working on adding the Azure Cache to our project. Now that we have added the category CRUD operations in our web application, let me stop that and switch back to the Azure portal. We have our Azure Cache for Redis right here. When we have to integrate this inside the .NET Core application, we need the key to access that. So inside the settings here, we will click on key. We have primary key, secondary key, but what we want to work with is the connection string. So we will copy this connection string, go back to our application. If we go to our app settings.json, we have a connection string for our database. Right here, let me create a new connection, and I will call this Azure Redis connection, and let me paste the connection string. Once we add the connection string, we have to configure the program.cs file to actually use that connection string and configure the distributed Redis cache. And for that, we will require a NuGet package. So we will go to Manage NuGet Packages for solution, Browse tab here, and we will search for package caching.redis. We have the Microsoft package, which is microsoft.extensions.caching.redis. Let's install that package inside our Redis cache project. Let me install that. And perfect, that looks good. Let's close that. Now we need to configure Redis cache inside the program.cs class file. So inside the builder.services, where we are adding services to the container, we will have to add one more, which is builder.services.add distributed Redis cache. When we add the Redis cache to our application, we have to configure some options here. And inside that option, we have the option of configuration where we need to pass the key. That key is inside app settings, so we can access that using builder.configuration.getConnectionString, and we need to pass the key name, that is Azure Redis Connection. I was able to use this directly because I added that inside the block of connection string. That's why I can use the built-in helper method getConnectionString. That will retrieve the connection string and configure our Redis cache. Simple as that. We did not have to do anything complex. It is just basic configuration because Azure Redis Cache is already managed for us. We did not have to do much configuration. Everything is taken care of. So with that, let's continue from the next video. Now that we have added the connection string for Azure Redis Connection in our project and we configured that in the program class file, let me close all the tabs here and open up the home controller. If we examine the views inside categories, we have the index view where we are displaying all the categories, but when we load this view, we are getting all the categories from database. Let me copy this view altogether and paste that inside home index. So right here, let me paste that. I will cut this model and paste it at the very top. So we just have a table where we are displaying all the categories, and the heading here we can change that to cached categories. So here we are just displaying a list of all the categories in a table format. That is pretty straightforward. But inside the home controller index view, we will actually have to load the categories and we will have to pass that. Before we do that, let me switch back to the presentation that we had. Inside here, when we get a request, we first check if that request is in cache. If not, we get that from the SQL database and we add that to the cache. So first request will not be inside the cache. We will have to go to the SQL server. So we need to add application DB context using dependency injection. That way we can go to database and retrieve all the categories. So inside the constructor here, we will have to add application DB context using dependency injection. Then inside the index action method, we will have to create a new list of category and we will have to retrieve them from the database. So let me create a variable here. I will call this cached category list. We will check here, if not, string.isNull or empty. If the cached category list is not null or empty, then this means we are getting that from cache. In the else part, this will be null the first time, so we will have to retrieve our cached category list from database. So _db.category.toList. This won't be the category list, it will be the category list right here. Let me just call this cached category to avoid any confusion. So right now we are not using caching, we are just retrieving that from the database. We will return back to the view and we will pass category list. So with this, if we run the application on the home page, we will again see all the list of categories. Let me show that. And perfect. This is working as expected. But now we want to cache these categories, and next time when we get the same request, we do not want to go to database, we just want to get that from the cache. So let me stop the application here and let's implement caching from the next video. In order to implement caching in our index action method, we need to retrieve that using dependency injection. We already configured that in the services right here, distributed Redis cache. So in order to get that inside the home controller, we will get the distributed cache. We will add the using statement, add that in the constructor here, and we'll say underscore cache is equal to cache. Then the first time we will actually retrieve everything from the database. But at that time, if we go back to the presentation, we have to add that to the cache. So if we go back, we have to add the categories that we retrieved to cache so that next time we can use that and retrieve that rather than going to database. So I will say underscore cache dot, we have the method there, which is setString. You can see it expects key and a value. Caching is based on key value pairs. That is what we have right here. So we have to give this a unique key. Let me call this category list. Now of course I do not like magic strings, so typically you will have a constant and use that. But we will have to give it a unique key name, so next time we can use that key name to retrieve the value. Now the value that we need to assign here has to be a string. So we will have to convert that, and we will use JSON convert for that. We will have to add the using statement for newtonsoft.json, and we will serialize our object, which is the category list, and we will assign that to our cache. Simple as that. We did not have to write any complex code or initialize the Redis cache object. Nothing of that kind was required. We just have to call setString on the distributed cache, and it will automatically cache the value with the key name of category list. So perfect, we are adding that to our cache. Inside the cached category, let's retrieve the value of this category list. So we just say underscore cache dot catch string. We have to pass the key name. Let's copy that to avoid any spelling mistake. Then if this cached category is null, we will go to database and store that. But if that is not null, we will have to deserialize that to a list of category. So we can say category list is equal to JSON convert, and we have the deserialized object, which will be a list of category, and we will pass the cached category. So with that, our logic is looking pretty solid. Now when we are running the Redis cache here, do not run on IIS Express. Make sure to select the same project name. That way when you run the project, it will open up the command prompt and it will launch the website. First time categories were loaded here, it would retrieve from the database and then it will add that to the Redis cache. But if you go on category here, and let's create one more category, I'll call this test with 4. It is displaying that inside the categories index page because at that time it goes to database, but if we go to the home page, we do not see that because the data that is being retrieved here is cached. If I go back to the application, add a breakpoint here, let me load this to show that. I will press F10 here. You can see the cached category has all the data. The new category that was created, we did not add that in cache. So that way it is loading all the categories that are stored in cache every time unless the cache is cleared. How do we clear that? There are multiple ways of doing that. If we go back to Azure portal, inside the Azure Cache for Redis, we can go to the console tab here and run the command flush all. That will flush all the cache, and if you go back to the application and refresh, this time you will notice the cache is null, so it goes to database and it retrieves the new record. Another way of doing that is, let me stop the application. Right here we have a command which is _cache.remove, and we have to give the key name, which is the category list, that will remove the value of that key from our Azure Redis cache. So with this you have seen caching in action. But when you are using caching, you have to be careful about few things. Let me walk you through those in the next video. We are using caching in our application. But what happens when you have to refresh the cache? Or what if you want to say that cache should expire in 1 hour or 1 day? We do not want the user to see stale data every time. So maybe the data is not time sensitive, but we want that after 10 minutes when the database has been changed, we want them to go to the database and get fresh data. How can we implement that when we are using Azure Cache? We can set all the options when we are setting a cache value. So when we are calling the set string here, we can create an object of distributed cache entry options. So we can call that options is equal to new, and then on that options we can set the absolute expiration time. So when it comes to expiration times, they are of two types. One is absolute and one is sliding. Sliding expiration basically means that if the cache has not been active for, let's say, 24 hours, then it will be expired. So if you have a key name of category list and you do not access that for 24 hours, in that case it will expire. But if you are accessing category list every hour, then it will not expire because your sliding expiration is 24 hours. The next type here is absolute expiration. This basically means that if you set a time like 60 minutes here, 60 minutes from the time the cache is set, it will expire. Even if you access every minute, then also it will expire after 60 minutes from when this cache was set the first time. So here, let me create a new time span. Let me make it 30 seconds for now. So with that, we have our options, but we need to add this options when we are setting the cache. So right here with the category list, we'll add a comma here. You can see we can also pass distributed cache entry options. So let me pass my options, which has the time span of 30 seconds. With that, let me run the application. Before we test anything, let's go to our Azure portal and flush all the cache that we have so far. And then if we go back to the application, we have cleared all the cache. So let me reload the page again. That way the cache will be set. So once the cache is set, let's go to category and create a new category. We only have 30 seconds. Once we create, let's go to the home page, not the categories. You can see it is not present here. That's great. Let's wait for 30 seconds. And once 30 seconds have been passed, if you refresh the page, you will see new data being loaded. So that proves that the cache that we had was invalidated, and then it went to the database to get new data. So with that, we have covered all the concepts with Azure Redis Cache, which is setting the cache, getting the cache, and how to invalidate a cache. Before I wrap up this video, inside the console window here, we have advanced settings where you can configure the port, and if you want, you can also scale up the application by selecting the different tier if you notice that you are using more data. We also have multiple clusters, but that is only available in the premium tier, not in the basic tier. We have geo-replication, which will replicate your data across different geolocation. That way, in case of a disaster, your cache is not affected. But all of these features are premium pricing, so they are not available in the basic tier. Another thing I want to show you is the firewall setting. If you want that only certain IP address can use your Azure Redis Cache, you can add that connection right here. But if no IP addresses are defined, then by default, any IP address is allowed to connect as long as the access key is valid. So we have more insights and monitoring that is available with Redis Cache. But with this, you have seen how easy it was to configure Redis Cache in a .NET application. So I hope you have liked this free video. If you want to enroll in the full Azure course, where I teach Azure Blob Storage, Azure Function, Azure Logic App, and many more .NET courses, always go to .NETmastery.com.